Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Dr. Bandi X. Lee. She's an assistant clinical professor in law and psychiatry at Yale School of Medicine. She earned her degrees at Yale, interned at Bellevue, was chief resident at Mass General, and was a research fellow at Harvard Medical School. She was also a fellow of the National Institute of Mental Health. She worked in several maximum security prisons, co-founded Yale's Violence and Health Study Group, and leads a violence prevention collaborators group for the World Health Organization. She's written more than 100 peer-reviewed articles, I'm jealous, edited academic books, and is the author of the textbook Violence. Dr. Lee, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to be able to do this interview. And the book we're talking about is called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. And what happened is you organized the Yale Duty to Warn Conference, and 27 mental health experts and psychiatrists basically assessed the president. Is that how this came to be?
Yes. If I may, I'd like to just say a disclaimer that I'm speaking on my own behalf and not representing the views of my institution, that is Yale University, Yale School of Medicine, or Yale Department of Psychiatry. Forgive me for having to do that. But before I just wanted to give the story of how this happened. Well, after inauguration, many mental health professionals have been concerned, and all my colleagues have started to express concerns. And in private, we shared the same concerns and felt that there could be a danger associated with this. But when I suggested that we write letters to Congress or maybe organize a conference to speak about it, everyone then stepped back, and they were afraid to put their names forth, first because of an ethical guideline that we have in psychiatry, which says that we should not diagnose public figures out in the open when we have not examined them in person.
This is what we call the Goldwater Rule, yes? The Goldwater Rule?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So the conference was just an ethics conference to discuss the Goldwater Rule versus the duty to warn. There are other ethical guidelines that we have that could potentially be countervailing or superseding in times of threat or emergency. And so these are the principles we generally think about when we deal with patients, for example. We keep with confidential rules and rules of confidentiality and consent unless there is an emergency. In an emergency, our duty to report, duty to warn, duty to protect, these things override even our sacrosanct rules of confidentiality and consent, which we hold very seriously. So this was just to discuss that, and we started with a reaffirmation of the Goldwater Rule, why that was important. But in a 500-person prime auditorium space in the Yale School of Medicine, only 20 showed up. That's how people were afraid and worried that they might become associated with this topic. But more than 100 people tuned in online, and then when the event got to be known, it was in the national and international news. Hundreds and hundreds of mental health professionals came forth. They were from this country as well as from abroad, and now they number in the thousands. So all these people who were actually afraid to appear in public, they later confided in me it wasn't so much the Goldwater Rule that stopped them, but the fear of being targeted by a vindictive president, losing their licenses, or being physically harmed by his violence-prone followers. So in private, it turned out there was this incredible groundswell of a movement that I had happened to tap into, and the book came out of just a small sampling of this group, and it's among some of the most eminent members of our field have come forth. And so we try to make this book a collection of our expertise on the topic.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And we may refer to the APA from time to time. I want to distinguish the American Psychiatric Association from the American Psychological Association. So this is the American Psychiatric Association. And they are committed to supporting the Goldwater Rule. And the question is, when is there a duty to warn? And that's a question that several of your authors dealt with in the course of this book. And there's some interesting citations of symptoms of various mental disorders. And many people wrote the disclaimer in it, look, I'm not diagnosing, I'm just saying that this is indicative of this kind of behavior is indicative of certain disorders, like unbridled hedonism. But the one I want to touch on first is narcissism, because to a certain extent, we're all narcissistic, and there was even a book in the 70s that came out that said Our Narcissistic Society about America. And if you think of it being a scale, a range of scores from almost no narcissism to extreme narcissism, there's a level that one reaches called malignant narcissism. Let's talk about what malignant narcissism is.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me distinguish between diagnosing someone, such as a public figure, versus educating the public about all the relevant conditions and possible aspects in mental health that could be useful for the public to know. The Goldwater Rule actually has two parts to it. One part is do not diagnose a public figure, and the second part is when asked about a public figure, do educate the public about relevant psychiatric issues in general terms. So we're actually keeping to the letter of the Goldwater Rule in terms of not diagnosing, but educating the public about all the relevant conditions and contexts. So I just wanted to make that clear. So we have kind of almost a laundry list of possible conditions listed, but you're right, narcissism is one of them. And you're also correct in that there's a wide range of narcissism. In fact, there's healthy narcissism and there's unhealthy narcissism, so it's actually not even all bad. We require a certain level of narcissism in order to get by in society. So it is not a matter of having it or not having it, it's a matter of degree. And there is narcissistic personality disorder that gets to the point where the narcissism is so severe that it's affecting relationships, it's damaging to the person, damaging to their goals. Even if they don't see it themselves, it's very bothersome to other people, and they end up defeating themselves. So it's self-defeating. And then there is malignant narcissism, where it becomes so severe that it brings on frank destruction to oneself as well as other people. And when we have that level of narcissism in leadership position, then it becomes a very destructive leadership that regardless of how much the person feels that they are serving themselves or serving a certain group, because it is pathology and not so much a choice based on looking at all the benefits or consequences, it almost inevitably leads to destruction. Well, that's a definition of disease, that it brings on destruction and death. And so that would be malignant narcissism. We can name some leaders throughout history who have held leadership positions despite having overt signs of malignant narcissism, and we know the end result has always been bad.
Mm-hmm. And we had an author on this show talk about his book where he looked at various presidents who likely had certain disorders, Lincoln's depression, Churchill's manic personality, the bipolar disorder that some presidents may have had. And so sometimes the disorder is exactly what makes those people who they are.
You are absolutely right. Some disorders actually increase compassion or empathy from the suffering that they endure, and those are known to be great leadership qualities. So mental illness does not automatically make someone impaired or unfit for duty. It also does not make one necessarily more dangerous. A great misconception out in the public is that mental illness makes someone more dangerous. That is not true. They are not any more dangerous than the average person. In fact, most dangerous individuals are not mentally ill. So dangerousness has to do with very specific symptoms or traits and the severity of the symptoms and the situation. So the same person with the same traits may not be dangerous if they were in another position or another situation. So assessing dangerousness is different from diagnosing a mental illness. And so I just want to make that clear, that even as we are taking on the duty to warn, that we're still keeping with the Goldwater Rule, and we're actually, when we do make specific statements about Mr. Trump, it's in keeping with another ethical rule, that is the duty to warn and then to argue our reasons for warning.
Very good. In the chapter that Philip Zimbardo and Rosemary Sword wrote about unbridled and extreme present hedonism, they talk about a time perspective theory and the 6 main time perspectives: past positive, past negative, future positive, future negative. But when I was reading the present hedonistic people and what their characteristics are, I couldn't help thinking that they looked at Trump's background before they wrote this: live in the moment, seeking pleasure, novelty, and sensation, and avoiding pain.
So all this work, actually, they have published work looking at these features independently before Mr. Trump,
sure.
before Mr. Trump's campaign. And all the diagnoses that follow, all of these are in the Diagnostic and Statistical manual. The criteria are. So one can go back and look at their original work or look at the original criteria and see that these are objectively, independently existing categories and bodies of work. So what they merely did was kind of shed it under the light of the current situation. But if you go back and see the criteria, then you'll see that these are syndromes that occur. In other words, Mr. Trump is not an isolated phenomenon. There are many people with his personality features. And in fact, I, being an expert on violence, have seen thousands of individuals with his exact same constellation. And so it's actually a very common personality appearance, but very uncommon to occur in the office of the presidency, and in fact, unprecedented in our nation's history.
And interesting that some of the personality traits of Donald Trump probably came about because of his relationship with his father. One of the suggestions is he may have had arrested emotional development, and they may have had something to do with his father sending him off to military school at the age of 13. But there's some interesting stuff about Fred Trump Sr. and his relationship to Donald. They had several children. Of course, Fred Trump Jr. died of complications of alcoholism, and so Donald became sort of the protege of Fred's real estate empire.
Yes. So some of these are, I think you might be referring to a piece that was written kind of as a self-reflection as well as Mr. Trump's situation. So none of this we can say is actually the case for Mr. Trump, because we have not personally evaluated him. But this is the way that psychoanalysts, mental health professionals think about other situations. They reflect back on what they have experienced themselves and use that as clinical data. So you objectify what you have experienced to extrapolate what the other might have gone through and what might explain their patterns of behavior. So yes, that is often a cause for narcissism, because narcissism, extreme narcissism, is about having a low sense of self-worth and feeling worthless, small, and insignificant, which is why one has to exaggerate one's greatness, that one is unprecedented in all these great ways, knows better than any expert in the field, and they have to project this sense outwardly to fight the terrible inner sense of being very small and insignificant. So that often translates into dividing the world into winners and losers, not having respect for people who are small in fear that one might identify with them, and also to engage in things that one may not quite have the qualifications for, and yet assert that now someone with extreme narcissism will not be able to see that they are unable to fulfill the obligations, because that thought alone is too painful for them. Just to think of themselves as a normal, average human being is too painful for them. That's why they have to be the best. They have to know the most. They have to do the most, and at least project that image. And they also need, very much in return, a lot of adoration and adulation, because they've been lacking that very basic affirmation or simple acceptance during childhood. That is generally the dynamic that happens. But again, this is all speculation.
Sure.
And we're only bringing it up because we feel that Mr. Trump in the office of the presidency poses a danger. And in that situation, what we normally do, we deal with dangerous individuals on an everyday basis. What mental health professionals generally do is restrain the person, remove them from access to weapons, and do a full evaluation, which will reveal all the reasons, what is really going on.
But he would have to be willing, right?
Not in an emergency situation.
Okay.
In an emergency, one is obligated to treat without consent and to treat even if the person is not a pre-existing patient. Our medical ethical codes actually require that we intervene right away, and that includes not just warning, but also taking steps to protect. In fact, all 50 U.S. states give us the legal authority and also at times the legal obligation to act in such times. And one of our great concerns is that none of us have done this because this is the office of the presidency and we have a certain level of respect for it. But in terms of the individual and the danger he poses, he has far exceeded the level at which we would have intervened long ago with any other individual.
I'm sorry.
This is a discomfort that we feel. Sorry.
Understood. And let's talk about some of the impacts of his particular behavior in terms of bullying and the Trump effect, and also in terms of sociopathy. What are we seeing that sends off red alerts?
Yeah, so often a history of violence or signs of violence in the past are a great indication of future violence. He has already shown verbal aggressiveness, a history of sexual assault, not just confessing it, but bragging about it. And that's actually even a more dangerous sign. Inciting violence, such as at its rallies, endorsing violence in public speeches, an attraction to violence and an attraction to powerful weapons that he has expressed, as well as taunting of hostile nations with actual nuclear power. And all these are signs of dangerousness. His personal traits that he shows, which are highly associated with violence, include impulsivity, recklessness, a loose grip on reality where real consequences don't really matter, a lack of empathy where devastation to millions of people may not really move him much, rage reactions, and this pattern of constantly needing to burnish a sense of power. That again comes from this feeling of smallness or worthlessness inside. And when the inner needs are so great, it affects one's ability to think rationally. It affects the ability to take in needed information, needed advice. It affects the ability to manipulate information, to think about real consequences, and make decisions that are reason-based, that are fact-based, consequence-based, and we're actually not sure that he's capable of that.
And another concern raised, and I found this interesting, based upon some of his speech patterns where a sentence is incomplete and he starts another thought, is cognitive impairment and possible dementia.
Yes, that's very much often a first sign of dementia. But again, dementia is a diagnosis, and we don't have all the information to be able to make a diagnosis because all these manifestations could be explained by many conditions. Many conditions look alike from the surface. So in order to make a diagnosis, we need all the information. In other words, not just a personal examination, but medical records, any follow-up from a personal examination. We need clinical data. So all these things are objectively observable, documentable data that would be supported by research and clinical expertise. And so you need all the information to make a diagnosis. You only need enough information to declare dangerousness and declare an emergency and the need for a full evaluation.
The impact of some of Trump's rhetoric on an unprecedented spike in hate crimes because of a rhetoric directed at African Americans and immigrants and LGBTQs and religious minorities and women and people with disabilities, all of that really scares me, and I think it also scares some of those marginalized groups.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we bring up the nuclear codes, the president's ability to launch nuclear weapons within 5 minutes, unimpeded by any questioning or intervention by anybody else. That is our most urgent concern because, in an impulsive reaction, he could do that without any recourse on our part, and we have enough nuclear power to destroy the world many times over. So that's our most emergent concern. But yes, there are signs of many other kinds of danger, and the next would be what you described, the dangerous effect he has on public health and public mental health. And you're right about the hate crimes, the historic spike in hate crimes the day after election, starting with the day after election, and then a lot of, there also has been a spike in gun violence. We cannot ignore that. Since his campaign, and especially since his inauguration, there's been something like a 25% rise in gun violence. And while we may not be able to connect each of those episodes to the president's rhetoric or to the president himself, he does have great influence on the culture of violence through his speeches, and that actually is a far greater predictor of beyond any individual characteristics of the violent offenders themselves or the gunmen. Recent gun episodes, far more important in terms of epidemics of violence or rises in societal trends of violence are the social, economic, and cultural changes that come about, and we cannot ignore the cultural change that he is bringing through his rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. And I want to dovetail on that with something that Jennifer Contarino Panning wrote about, and that was Trump anxiety disorder.
Yes. Yes, we are experiencing also this unprecedented spike in mental health symptoms of mental illness, if not a frank diagnosis, at least a rise in symptoms. And therapists have been noting this almost universally. Those who have been traumatized in the past, those with post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, are experiencing recurrence of symptoms because the president reminds them of their abusers, has many of the traits. But also those who had been previously healthy are now experiencing symptoms of anxiety like they had never done before. And now the American Psychological Association has put out their study of a survey of symptoms across the board, and they are now saying that we are at our worst point of complaints and mental health symptoms since World War II. So it's worse now. The public mental health state is worse now than during World War II, during the Vietnam War, during the September 11 terrorist attacks. So this is really huge, and it's being felt at all different levels everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And the chapter by Harper West in relationship with an abusive president talks about a couple of things that we could touch on. One is deception and other blamers. Other blamers it has characteristics that so much fit with my perception of what's going on, like placing a high value on personal loyalty and surrounding themselves with yes men and isolating partners and convincing the victims that they don't have their best interest at heart, and being attracted to power and tending to misuse it, promoting images of success. I mean, all of that just resonates for me in terms of my concerns about this presidency.
Yes, so it's a very typical portrait, if you will, of an abusing person, of a bullying person, a violent person, the personalities that we normally do not see out in public. In fact, I work in jail and prison settings, and so I encounter them a lot, but it's very rare that I encounter them elsewhere. And the pattern is very consistent. Yes, they will never take responsibility. They will never blame themselves. They will blame others, in fact, attack others who may show any criticism or report any unflattering news or be in any way less than completely adoring, adulating, and compliant. And so what we're seeing from many of his cabinet members, for example, people were surprised that everyone was so adoring and almost flattering beyond anything they've seen. That is because he requires it.
Yeah. Dr. Kessler's chapter on birtherism begins with the statement, he straddles the country's divide between those who cheer his ascendance to the presidency and those who are greatly disturbed by it. I think that sums up the concern.
Yes. My goodness, I'm impressed at how thoroughly you've gone through through this book.
Well, touch on the birtherism, because that really is the start of what propelled him into the spotlight this time. I mean, he obviously had had notoriety for years and years, but the birtherism thing he took the lead on.
Right, and that is one of the most troubling aspects, because to have a president who has been propelled by a conspiracy theory, basically an unreality, and for that to be the galvanizing force is very troubling. So this also brings in the problem we're having currently with fake news. Not the fake news that the president defined, but real news that is false. In that, when we have kind of a tenuous state of public mental health, what we wish to do, what a normal society does, is try to bring back some of the members who are having trouble believing in reality or who have a loose grip on reality, is that you keep confirming reality to them, even if it's not what they wish to believe, and you bring them back. And you bring them to focus and allow them to focus on real things, to get gratification from real things, to think about real consequences. But what we have through this fake news ecosphere, if you will, an echo chamber in the internet world, is that you have people's conspiracy theories, their delusions being confirmed rather than reality being confirmed. And so it's actually worsening their pathology. Mm-hmm. So because they already have an emotional pull to believe it to begin with, you're actually confirming it and allowing them to even further develop their delusions. And even if they wouldn't be each individually diagnosable with a mental illness, you are creating a mass hysteria, which is a sort of mental illness at larger scale that is dependent on certain mentally ill individuals influencing the rest. And so when we have a powerful public figure with mental impairments affirming their delusions and actually the president repeating those delusions, then we have an incredibly powerful pathology generating and spreading force. Mm-hmm. And usually what you do in clinical situations, it is usually called shared psychosis. So when you're in the same household, say with a psychotic person, then it's not the healthy people who are able to bring the person back. It really takes a lot of treatment and a lot of intervention to bring the person back to reality. But rather, it's the psychotic person who engages all the healthy people in their psychosis, so that the whole household becomes psychotic, if you will, out of touch with reality. And the treatment during those times is to separate them.
I appreciate it very much. We've been talking with Dr. Bandy Lee. The book is The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. It's by St. Martin's Press. It's a very good read. I remind our listeners, if you don't catch our regularly scheduled broadcast, you can find us on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.